I'm delighted to be in conversation today with Anusha Rao and Suhas Mahesh. This book of theirs, I was gifted this last year, and it's been an absolutely delightful read. And I thought today, before we start the session where I would be chatting with them about the book, about the process of how they went about curating it and translating it, I'd like to start with one of my favorites. If you have the book, it's verse number 5 on page 7. After creating her, God must have gazed at his work admiringly, holding her face in his hands, thumb on each cheek. That's how she got her 2 perfect dimples. This is, I think, from the Naishadhya Charita. The book is full of delightful pieces, and I think they're for sale outside, and I think if you pick up a copy, I can guarantee that there will be many hours of wonderful reading of what the Sanskrit poets and other poets have to tell us. So years ago, I was working on a script, and when I started reading your book, I was reminded of that for a Bharatanatyam performance by a dancer, Nandini Kamath. She had 6 pieces in it, and she called it Shades of Love. And during my research, I came across this quote, which was that Sanskrit has 96 words for love, ancient Persian has 80, Greek has 3, and English has 1. Is this one of those internet legends, or does Sanskrit really have, as a language, more words for love than any other language? You need it.
This is perhaps an internet legend, but it is true that Sanskrit has a vast number of words for any particular concept that you want. Maybe not for love, but for instance, elephant or fire, you can easily find about 100 words each. So maybe not for love, but it's definitely a special language that does this for a lot of things.
To add on to that, I think one of the unique properties of Sanskrit that lets it have so many synonyms for a single word is that you can build together compounds from blocks of words. So, for example, if you want to say a tree, you can say padapa, something that drinks with its feet. If you want to say cloud, then you can say the thing that carries water. So every word for carry and every word for water put together will give you the word for cloud. So similarly for love too, it does have many words, but since it's not a compound word of this, we would say it's an internet legend.
I was thinking also that that long list must have words like, say, Vatsalya, which is for parental love, or Maitri, which is a benevolent, friendly love, or even Bhakti, which is the love of the divines. But your book is not about those. Your book is about romantic love, right?
That's
so
right.
It's, in that sense, it is zeroed in only on perhaps a few of those. Perhaps, I don't know if there are 96 words or not. Did you find when you started this project, and did you find raised eyebrows and nervous giggles when you told people you're working on love poetry? I noticed in your book, in your acknowledgements, you have quite charmingly thanked your families and requested them to skip chapter 6. Chapter 6 is how to make love. And is it because Sanskrit has this reputation of being this hallowed language of the gods, of hymns, of incantations? Or is it that the shadow of the Kama Sutra is so heavy and pervasive that it's difficult to visualize love in all its other nuances? What was your experience when you told people what you're working on?
I would say it's a little bit of both. You zeroed in on it exactly. The problem is that when you tell people about Sanskrit, there's one section of people who thinks of it as the sacred language of the gods, not to be sullied with mundane things like love. And then you have another section who only thinks of the Kama Sutra. But there is so much more to explore in Sanskrit literature about love. And one of the surprises that we've encountered in responses to the book is that Sanskritists or traditional Sanskrit scholars are very comfortable with the book, as are people with no acquaintance with Sanskrit. But there is a faction of the middle that is deeply uncomfortable with Sanskrit.
Which has some preconceived ideas of what the language
exactly, of what
can
it
be
should
used
talk
for.
About. Yeah.
Okay. Could you give us an idea of the time period of these poems? I'm not sure, but I think the oldest is from the Atharva Veda. Is it possible? Or
I think we have one from the Rig
We
Veda.
have one from the Rig Veda as well.
Yes, correct.
So that is the oldest attestation of any kind of poetry from India. So that would be maybe 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. And we have sections all the way from 3000 BC, 1000 BC. We have a lot of material from right around when the Christian era starts, and all the way down till the 18th century and even the 21st century. So we even have a couple of really amazing poems written by a professor at Delhi University, a poet in Bangalore. So we've tried to cover the whole period, really.
We have poems by you too.
Yes, there are a
Which
couple
is
by me
as
well.
modern as they
Yeah.
get.
Yes, yes.
What about the geographical spread? From Kashmir, I noticed, in the north. How south does it go?
It goes all the way till Tamil Nadu. So in fact, Sanskrit really starts flourishing in Tamil Nadu around the 16th century. So the best kind of Sanskrit is being produced in the south. It's after the 15th century or so, it declines in the north. And we have a lot of examples of that from Tamil Nadu. We have some from Karnataka. So the entire subcontinent really, and a book says that. So below every poem, it tells you where in India it was produced, and you'll see that it's all across the subcontinent. And one of the great things about the tradition really is that it was a completely integrated tradition. So somebody would write something in Kashmir, and 5 years later, you would have somebody in Tamil Nadu reading it and responding to it. And if you wrote something in the south, within 5 years, it would be in Banaras, and all the pundits there would be discussing it. So there's a lot of talk today about the idea of India. What exactly is it? Was there an idea of India? And I think the existence of this Republic of Letters, which was a very strong Republic of Letters, that is perhaps one of the answers to was there an India? Because this Republic of Letters very clearly stretched between Gujarat to Assam and Kashmir to Kanyakumari. So this clearly existed.
In one of your poems, one of the footnotes, each poem has a little footnote apart from the source and the poet. There are tiny nuggets of information which are quite delicious. And one of them I noticed you said, I think it's from the Gaha Saptasai, where you said this poem went viral in those days. And is that what you meant when you just said that a poem could originate in one part and then ricochet through other parts of India?
Exactly. So a lot of the poems that are in this book, they essentially went viral. So if there are people here who read old Telugu or old Hindi, Braj Bhasha, old Kannada, it's not unlikely that you would find verses that are exact translations of what you see here. In most cases, it was that these verses went from Sanskrit into other languages, from Prakrit into other languages. But there are some cases where the opposite happened. So for instance, there's this one verse in our book about two deer.
Why don't you read it out?
I don't know if I can
it's
locate it, but I'll tell
titled-
you what the idea is.
Okay.
I remember the Sanskrit version, so I can tell you the Sanskrit one. Trishitam harinim harinaha, trishitam harinam vijanati harini, mitamambu palvalastham, kapatam pibataf paraspara lokam. It's a lot easier to remember Sanskrit than it is to remember English, so remember those. So what's happening here is there are two deer, a deer and a doe, and they're really thirsty, and they've chanced upon a little puddle of water. And both of them know that that little puddle isn't enough for both of them to drink. So each is only pretending to drink while looking at the other. And this verse we found in a book that was compiled in a Mughal court. It was compiled on the orders of the Subedar of Bengal, who was, I think, the nephew of Aurangzeb, but was related to Aurangzeb. And it was only later that we discovered that this is actually the translation of a Sangam Tamil poem. This is not in the book because we discovered it later, but we're sure that there must be other instances where the translations have happened from Tamil into Sanskrit and other languages.
So the title of the book is How to Love in Sanskrit, and I know it's punchier to say that than to say How to Love in Sanskrit, Prakrit, Apabhramsha, and Pali, because these are the other languages in the poems. But Sanskrit, I think, has about 75% would I say, of the 200 odd poems in this. Tell us a little bit about these other languages, Apabhramsha, Prakrit, I think we are more familiar with. And I think you have one poem in Pali, or was it one poem in Apabhramsha?
One in Pali and one in Apabhramsha as well. So So this is the question that we've most commonly got after writing the book. A lot of people were offended that we
you
only
left out.
mentioned the Sanskrit. So maybe we should address the prevalent misconception first, that these are two entirely separate literary traditions. So the misconception goes that Prakrit is the language of the masses and everyone was talking in it, and Sanskrit is this highbrow, elitist kind of language. But the most famed love poetry in the book is actually from the Gaha Sattasai, or the Gatha Saptashati, which is a Prakrit text. And so these are the poems that went viral and were copied into Sanskrit so many times. And it turns out that Prakrit was actually as elitist as Sanskrit in that sense, in that so Prakrit even has a boast that you claim to speak on matters of love, and yet you don't know Prakrit. What a shame. So Prakrit is known to be the mellow kind of language of love, unlike Sanskrit with its harsh-sounding consonants. But maybe I'll let Suhas speak a bit about the development of Prakrit and Apabhramsha.
So, I mean, a lot of people actually think that Sanskrit is an artificial language, which nobody ever spoke, and this scholarship knows to not be true. So Sanskrit was spoken in kitchens and in bedrooms about 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. And as languages change on our tongues, Sanskrit changed into Prakrit, different Prakrits all over North India. And this Prakrit, in some sense, is actually not very far from Sanskrit. So I'll give you an example. So in Sanskrit, if you say, Esha nicho jano bhavati, he is a wicked man. In Prakrit, that would be, Eso niyo jano hoi. So Esha nicha jano bhavati, Eso niyo jano hoi. So it's not all that far. So in the South Indian languages, we have this split too, where we speak in a different way, we write in a different way. Avanu nichanada purusha, avanu nich purusha. So it's essentially the same kind of diglossia between Sanskrit and Prakrit. But this doesn't mean that it's not a different language. It has its own, it has a slightly different grammar, it has its own conventions and things like that. But Prakrit developed a very, very different literary tradition, especially one in love. So Sanskrit says that, in Prakrit it's said that Sanskrit sounds like a house of bamboo on fire. It crackles and pops. It's not a very pleasant language. But Prakrit has these very pleasant sounding syllables, and it sounds really nice. So to give you an example, maybe I'll recite a Prakrit verse for you, because nobody ever gets to hear Prakrit these days. And I'll maybe can use this occasion to read out a Prakrit verse along with its...
Could you read it from the Gaha Satasai? Because I had a question about that I read that it is considered the extreme opposite of the Kama Sutra, and the quote that I read was that it's about the messy reality of life, where seduction formulae don't work, love seems complicated and emotionally unfulfilling, end quote. So this text, and you've quoted it a lot in your book, so is the verse that you are about to read from there?
I can read a verse from the Satasai, why not? Let's read a...
Or if you have another favorite.
I can read this one. So I'll read out the English first. The title of the verse is Can't Take My Eyes Off You. On whatever bit of her the gaze first lands, there it stays pinned. No one knows her in all her loveliness. And the Prakrit for that would be Jassa jahimchi apadhamam tissa angammi nivadiya ditti tassa tahim cheyathiya savvangam kenavina dittham. Now, if you translated this into Sanskrit, you could write one-to-one correspondence because it's so close. So in that case, it would be Etavan matre jagati Sundara mahila sahasra bhritepi anuharati navaritissa vamardham dakshinardasya, something like that. So it's pretty close, but Gaha Satasai is full of hundreds of these kinds of beautiful verses, and there are maybe 50 of those in this book. And that's probably the cream of the book, I would say, is from Gaha Satasai.
In your introduction, you have sort of burst this romantic bubble that we shouldn't assume that the average householder in those days was amazingly gifted in romantic poetry, and that these poems were not sweet murmurings of ordinary men and women to their partners. So who was composing them, and in what sort of context, in what audience?
So most of this is court poetry.
Court poetry.
Yes. So where you have gifted poets maybe writing to impress the king or reading their poetry out to other very learned people who then appreciate it. Later, of course, many of these get written into texts. So some of them are parts of compilations of beautiful verses, which is how we come across them. Some of the verses that we've got are even only in manuscript form, so they're no longer even published. And we are working on a couple of manuscripts that way, which is how we've come across them. So yeah, from a very broad range of
So they were the usual suspects. I mean, Kalidasa, Bana, Bhartrihari, these were, we expect to see them. But I saw that you have a Jain monk, a Buddhist monk. You have Aurangzeb's uncle, Shaista Khan. And these were, interesting. You have made an effort to, I think, also show poems from a wide range of poets, not just stick to the ones who are the poster boys of classical poetry. So what context were monks writing this poem? I mean, later in the Bhakti tradition, one hears of erotic love being used as a metaphor for divine love. But at the time that you have been featuring that era, was that the case? Or was it romantic poetry?
I think one of the interesting things to note is that monks of the days that we are talking about, say in the 10th century, the 6th century, they don't really draw the same distinctions that we do. It is not taboo for them to indulge in writing a romantic verse. In fact, you have these compendiums of verses that are collected by monks, which feature everything from devotional poetry to erotic poetry, slotted into those categories. And the monks seemingly had no qualms about writing these. So there's one interesting verse by Dharmakirti. I think it features at the very start.
So that's the one that Radhika read out at the very start.
The dimples. It's called Dimples.
Sorry, not Dimples. So it's actually the one that comes before that.
The first one. I think the first poem is by a Jain monk, I think.
So this is the third. Let me read that out. So the translation says, "Why I am an atheist. When the Creator made her, if he had his eyes open, would he have let her leave heaven? Surely not. If he had his eyes shut, could he have achieved such perfection? No chance. Therefore, it is proved that the Buddha was right. There is no creator." So here you have Dharmakirti, a heavyweight of Buddhist philosophy, who so seamlessly blends together his belief in Buddhism and its atheistic nature with a very romantic verse about someone beautiful. So they were able to joke. I think one of the biggest things that we've lost today is the ability to imagine these people of ancient times as being humans who could laugh, who could have
desires.
Yeah, who could have desires, who could enjoy poetry for its own sake.
And it's also interesting to note that in the Indian tradition, literature generally has a flattening effect. So you can have a certain belief, you can belong to a certain party when it comes to your religious, your philosophical beliefs. But if you're writing literature, then all those bets are off. You can write whatever you want because that operates in a completely different universe. And Anusha is in fact doing some research on this. So
the Sanskrit adage goes, "Nirankushah kavayaha." Poets have no fetters, and they're not meant to. The poet is usually compared to the creator, Brahma, and is even one up on Brahma because he can go where the creator can't go. He can do anything.
So in fact, it's not uncommon to find a poem that was commissioned by a king, paying a poet, I don't know, quite a lot of money. But in the first 100 verses of the poem, you have a couple of verses that are censuring kings and saying that, kings are good for nothing. Why do we work for these kings and things like this? But this is completely okay, and the king is also probably happy to read these verses because he understands that this is a part of the literary tradition and probably enjoyed them too. So it's an interesting feature of Indian literature.
So on that note, here's another poem, poem number 67, if you have the book. It's called Can't Have Enough. When he's in front of me, full of sweet nothings, I'm not quite sure. Have I turned all eyes or all ears? Now, the interesting thing, and maybe Anusha can weigh in on this, is this true or is it a legend that Adi Shankara was challenged in a debate and clueless on this matters as a monk, he entered the body of King Amaru, learnt the syllabus, won the debate, and also wrote the whole book, Amaru's 100. Is it one of those later editions or thing? Or
of course, we won't find any mention of this in the Amaru Shataka itself, in the Sanskrit text. But then we don't know so much of the context because a lot of Sanskrit poets are boastful and many others, many more, are self-effacing. So they tell us literally nothing about themselves. In fact, one of the manuscripts that I mentioned we both are working on says, the manuscript itself says that it was collected by the disciple of the author who actually found the manuscript at the mercy of mice in a well somewhere, in an old well somewhere. And the only snippets we can glean from the manuscript itself are because the disciple actually wrote them rather than the author. So in most of these, you would find next to or no context at all.
So there is a general belief that Indians are not very good at documentation. You know, there is an alibi that we use. How difficult was it to find the authorship of all these poems? Are they mentioned? You know, unlike, say, the Urdu tradition where you could have the signature at the end. Do you have, do scholars need to do detective work to figure out who was the actual author, if they were self-effacing and anonymous?
It's a difficult question. So sometimes you have 3 or 4 different books that have the same verse, and all of them give us different names for the authors. So it's difficult to know. So for instance, there's one verse in this, a very interesting verse which you should look up, by the Chalukyan queen Vidya, also called Vijika. And she writes, it seems to be about her own husband in the poem. And she was a very colorful person who also said that, they describe Saraswati as white, but they haven't seen me who's dark complexioned.
Clearly I'm dark-skinned.
Because I'm dark-skinned. So, and this was, it would have been great if it was actually by Vijika or Vidya, because it seems to be written by a woman if you look at the content of what it says. But if you look at 3 or 4 different sources, one of them says Vidya, the other says somebody else. So it's hard to actually know. And this is the case with a lot of the verses. So we take a slightly conservative approach here. So when we are somewhat sure of the author, we write the author's name down. If not, we don't mention the author's name. So for instance, Amaru's 100, it just says Amaru's 100. It doesn't say that Amaru is the author in the book, because we don't know anything about Amaru.
I have to add here that the last 3 poems in the book are by Suhas. His name is not there, but they were by him, and he stuck his name only into the Sanskrit version of it. So yes, before anyone else assumes that these were anonymous poet. In your introduction, you had this, you said, how does one say, I love you in Sanskrit? And you answer it saying, you don't. That is not the way the Sanskritic mind thinks. How does the Sanskritic mind think?
So I'm not sure how many of you have seen the Kannada movie Kaviratna Kalidasa, but that has a little scene where Kalidasa asks someone, or is it someone who asks Kalidasa what his name is? And the way of doing that is you don't say what's your name, or even as we say in modern Indian English, what's your good name? You would say which letters are fortunate enough to find a place in your name. So this is how the Sanskritic tradition does it. So you would do a lot of other things, but you would not say, I love you. In fact, there's a verse where a well-known writer on rhetoric says, it is obscene to just say it so plainly, like to tell someone, I love you so much, why don't you love me back? In fact, you should say it in a much nicer way, like, I'm so pleased that the love God who torments me to this degree is leaving you alone unscathed somehow. And that gives you more of a chance at winning their affection.
So that brings us to the challenge that you must have faced in translating these, because on the one hand, you have Sanskrit, which is maximalist, full of hyperbole, metaphors, linguistic acrobatics, perhaps, and you have chosen to, I think, as an objective, to make it accessible, these poems accessible to a reader who may have no knowledge of Sanskrit. So how did you do this leap? As in, you must have had to work a lot on what to strip away, or did you choose poems based on what you thought was their translatability into the form that you wanted?
Yeah, it's, I think most of the work that went into this book was one of curation. Because if you just choose verses without thinking too hard about them, then you're going to encounter all kinds of problems in trying to connect with a modern reader. So for instance, in Sanskrit, you may call a beautiful woman Rambhoru, which means, "O woman with thighs like the stem of a plantain." So there's no way to make that palatable in English. There are also all kinds of references to mythology. So for instance, in Sanskrit, you have this, there's supposed to be this submarine fire that burns inside the ocean. And that might come up somewhere in a love poem, which makes perfect sense if you're reading Sanskrit and you know all about it, but otherwise it's very difficult without footnotes to make it relatable to the reader. So we read about 10,000 poems before actually choosing these 200. It was a lot of reading, which we enjoyed doing. But exactly as Radhika said, we had to strip away. First, we had to filter down to the poems that actually don't have a lot of this kind of detail that modern readers wouldn't know about. And after that, it was also some amount of replacement. So for instance, if the poem calls a woman Rambhoru, it doesn't really have any real connection to bananas. That is very clear. It's just another way of saying beautiful girl. So we just translate it as an equivalent as beautiful girl or something like that. And another problem with Sanskrit poetry is that all Sanskrit poetry is actually 4 lines long. A lot of people don't know this, but so that means that in 4 lines, you need to start your idea and you need to end your idea in 4 lines. A Sanskrit poem is a self-contained unit in 4 lines. These lines can be small, so dharma kshetre kurukshetre is 1 line, with a small meter, or it can be long. So for instance, nritya dhurjati karagata damaruka dhumu dhumu paturava paripanthinya. This is 1 line in a much longer meter. And to fit all of these things into 4 lines, Sanskrit poets are very, very, they're very, very, there's a lot of brevity in Sanskrit, so it might refer to an entire episode in some other book by just using 1 word. And so we need to really flesh all of this out for the modern readers, and that takes a lot of work. So for instance, today, if we say the dragon burnt the night to a crisp, it's very clear to us, because of the world we are embedded in, that dragons spit fire and that the night was burnt by the dragon's fire that came out of its mouth. But 1,000 years from now, if somebody is translating an English text that says this, the reader may wonder, was the dragon carrying a weapon of some sort? Did it have a flamethrower? Did it have servants who did this? It's not clear, and this problem pops up in Sanskrit all the time. So we have done a lot of fill in the blanks, which I think if you go to any Sanskrit scholar, they would agree almost immediately. It's like saying the dragon burned the night to a crisp. None of us would debate that. So I think we've done a lot of fill in the blanks, but all obvious fill in the blanks. There's not much ambiguity there.
And what about the process? So you chose these poems, and how did you go about? Did you all do it together? Did you have a process for that too, for the translations?
So we found that the best way to go about it was for both of us to translate the poem individually. And then once we did that, we would get together and read each other's translations. And we found that a lot of the time, we did not agree on what the poem essentially meant or how we were interpreting it. So we were reading it quite differently. And then that made us think some more. And we went back to the poem, we looked at some commentaries, we thought about the context more deeply. And ultimately, I think we arrived at a version that we both could agree was the best possible representation of what the poem actually meant. And
Do you
we
have an
went with that.
example of where
Yeah.
you would have said, is that how you read it? I didn't read it that way.
Yeah. So this would be verse 133, if anyone has a book. So I can read the translation out. The weaker sex. She goes to meet him in the dead of night, braving the rain, charging through the thorns, crossing a river or two, even stomping on snakes without a care. Then she reaches his bed and pauses for his arm to help her up. So,
So what did you disagree on?
yeah. So I'll come to that. Now, the interesting thing about this poem is that we left the ambiguity there for readers to figure out how they want to read it. But when we were talking about this, the disagreement that we had was Suhas was reading it as a female ploy, where clearly she's very capable of climbing up the bed, but she's using her feminine wiles and she wants his help to climb up. Whereas I was thinking about the larger Sanskrit tradition, in which you have, say, poetry like the Kumara Sambhava of Kalidasa, in which Parvati, if you're familiar with the text, actually performs a lot of penance in order to win Shiva's love. And at the start of her penance, Kalidasa has this really beautiful verse where he says that she keeps aside her her way of looking, her gaze, and she gifts it to the deer, and her way of walking to the vines. Temporarily, as a deposit, she gives it to them until she's done with her penance. So here, I think what we see is that this way of looking in a beautiful way, sidelong glances, which deer are famous for in Sanskrit, and Parvati is famous for as well, and her gait, her manner of walking that is so attractive, but not suited for penance. So these come naturally to women in the Sanskritic tradition. It is not a ploy or a wile that women employ to get the attention of someone else. But the right place for it is not during penance when Parvati is performing it. Or in this verse, the right time for it is not when you're having to undergo all these adventures just to reach the man you love. But once she reaches him, that is when she resumes her natural
And
mode.
she can be herself again.
Yes, she can be herself again, and she's fine being vulnerable and stretching her arm out and asking to be helped up. So that was how I read it, and it's left to you which of us you agree with.
So just wanted to add one more thing here. So in Sanskrit, in English we say show, don't tell. And that is also a big part of Sanskrit poetry. So that comes under the whole philosophy of dhvani, resonance. So where you suggest things to the reader. And there's a very nice verse that says that what a poem should be like. So it says, Nandri payodara ivatitaram prakasho. So a poem shouldn't be like the women of Andhra Pradesh. This is Andhra Pradesh of long time ago, who wear very little on their bodies. No Gurjari stanai vatitaram nigudaha. Not like the women of Gujarat who wear too much. Artho giram apihita pihita kadachit saubhagyameti marahatta vadhu kuchavaha. So poem should be like the women of Maharashtra, Marahatta as they used to say them. Not wearing too much nor wearing too little. And in that way you have the most impact on the reader. So as a result of this philosophy, apihitaha pihitaha, that actually causes some amount of ambiguity in the poem. But we have tried to preserve this ambiguity. So in most cases, we haven't actually taken a side in the book.
When I was reading them, I was reminded of Arvind Krishna Mehrotra's translations of Kabir. I think he's also done the Gata Saptasahi. In the sense that there was this flavor of being playful, irreverent, comfortable use of contemporary slang, colloquialisms. Were you informed or influenced by any other translator of poetry when you began this work?
I mean, there are translations we really enjoy, Arthur Ryder being one of them. But I think what drove us more was wanting to create a translation that we would have enjoyed reading if we couldn't read the Sanskrit. And that was the driving factor.
I think I agree, and I think we were very frustrated by the fact that often friends would come to us knowing that we know Sanskrit and ask us, could you recommend a translation for us so that we could introduce ourselves to Sanskrit or somebody else? And we could honestly never really recommend something wholeheartedly because we felt that anything we recommended would just turn them away from Sanskrit. So I think this was born out of that. But maybe we'll just say aloud a couple of translators whom we really like so that you can go look them up. We really like Arthur Ryder, who was lived more than 100 years ago, but fantastic. And Hank Heifetz, who just passed away a couple of months ago. He translated the Kumara Sambhava as the birth of the young god, I think.
We also really enjoy David Shulman and Gal Bronner's translations of the Sanskrit.
Somadeva Vasudeva and Shaba Dezo as well. These are some of our favorites.
So you mentioned that quite a few of the poems are unpublished, which I'm guessing, therefore, you did not have prior translations, but many of the poems would have already been translated before you began work on it. And when you began your work, was that an attempt to keep faith with the tradition of how these poems have been interpreted? Or did you have a new take on it, a new spin, which you have presented to us?
I think some of both, I would say. So in certain cases, I think there's a particular verse, I'm not sure how to find it though, where we have an elaborate commentary that reads the verse in a really interesting way. And since all readers of English are not familiar with the commentarial tradition at all, that kind of reading of the poem is completely lost to us. So in that case, we did take the side of the commentary, so to speak, and we translated it the way the commentator read the verse. In other cases, we felt like some translations missed the point of the verse or missed the punch. And we really wanted to preserve the effect that we thought the Sanskrit verse would have on an audience it was meant for, to a reader of English. So some of both, I would say, which is why we've modernized some of the poems into a new context.
Can we give an example of that?
Yes, please do.
So I think some of the most common feedback that we have got about the book is that there are maybe 4 or 5 verses in the book where we have modernized the context of the verses. So, for instance, there are words like cell phone or Vogue magazine.
Or thermodynamic equilibrium.
Thermodynamic equilibrium.
Yes.
That's coming from me as a scientist. So there are 4 or 5 verses of this nature.
There's a mention of a flight.
A flight, yeah.
Yes.
There's a mention of a
and
flight.
I have to say, Suhas's poem talks about swiping left.
Yes. So, and there are good reasons why we have done this. You can be the judge of whether this experiment has succeeded or failed, and we'll incorporate that feedback into our next book. But so I'll read out one to explain to you why we did this. So this 119, don't marry an academic.
Oh, I have to mention that was on my list to ask you, because Anusha also writes a column for the Deccan Herald where she connects Sanskritic texts or legends and stories with very contemporary issues. And when you hear the poem, you'll realize why it resonates so much, given the recent conversations, shall we say, we have been having about work-life balance in the corporate world. I have a new title for that poem, and it should be called 70 or 90 Hours.
So this is coming from the wishing tree of Rasa Kalpadruma, 1700 CE. The break is done, and the semester is here, stealing his attention like a second wife. His lectures are all that he can think about. I can flirt all I like. I'm not getting any tonight.
So I think I'll read the Sanskrit version of this, and I'll tell you why it's so difficult to translate. So the Sanskrit says, Samagata hanta tithir dvitiya sakhid dvitiya daiteva patyuhu yadetad adhyapana magna cheta namam upetam api sandadhati. So obviously there are no semesters in the Sanskrit. What you have instead is the dvitiya tithi. So you know how you have the days of the fortnight in Sanskrit, those would be the Dvitiya, Tritiya, and so on. And the first day of the fortnight is actually called an Anadhyayana Divasa. So you're not meant to study scripture on that day, which is the day that so seemingly busy academics would get a break and perhaps pay attention to their lovers or wives. And then when the second day of the fortnight comes, the Dvitiya, they would get back to their work. It's work as usual. And so she's complaining about the second day of the fortnight, Samagata Hanta Sakhi Dvitiya. Now, if we wanted to explain this, we would need to give you a very elaborate footnote about the days of the fortnight and how it's an Anadhyayana Divasa, etc., which takes away from the punch of the verse. So we decided to follow the Sanskritic tradition itself, which has a very interesting verse. It says, Kavya svadana velayam shabdotpatti vichintakaha nivi vimoksha velayam vastramaulya vicharakaha. So someone who thinks about the derivation of words and grammar and syntax while reading poetry is like someone who thinks about the cost of the clothes as he's loosening the waist knot of a woman. So here, to really appreciate the poem, if you're focusing on the wrong things, such as why the Dvitiya is important here, you're missing out on the actual fun of the poem, which is why we thought it is not that much of a stretch to translate Dvitiya as the start of the semester. That is precisely what it is. So we would argue that any true Rasika or poet in the Sanskrit would agree that we've preserved the spirit of the verse. Because of this verse that I just quoted, they agree that you shouldn't be thinking about mundane things instead of the flavor of the poem itself.
And if anybody comes to us and says that this poem actually says any of the poems in the book say something that's not in the original, then we take that as an extreme compliment to ourselves because that means we made it up and the poems are genuinely fantastic. So, so it's actually not us, it's all the original authors.
But actually, that leads to my next question, because yes, you are editors, you are compilers, you are translators, you are academics, but you're also poets. Do you see yourself as poets? Because each poem here is a freshly created, creative work. So do you see yourself only as translators, or did you ever find it has been said that, translators of poems can have the boundaries blurring between, is it my poem that I'm making, or am I only conveying a sentiment that has already been expressed to a new audience? So did you face this, or do you even say to yourself that, yes, we are poets? I mean, Suhas has 3 poems, or 4 poems in the book. But apart from that, the fact that each poem here is a fresh piece.
Do you want to take that since you already have the poems written?
No, but Anusha, you will be more interesting because you haven't written separate poems. So as a translator of poems, do you see yourself also as, in a sense, continuing the tradition as a poet?
I would say if I do, it would be if I were writing poetry of my own, because I'm too firmly, I think it comes also from being an academic, that you can't insert your own ideas into work that you're supposed to be faithfully explaining, arguing about, or reading in the primary source. So I don't think the lines are as blurred for me. I do indulge in writing a Sanskrit verse or two, not usually romantic poetry, and my skills are rusty now. But yeah, I don't think the boundaries blur for me that much, because it's very clear that I'm reading a poem from a poet elsewhere, and as someone who enjoyed it as a Rasika.
And your focus is on how to
exactly,
get conveyed.
Yeah.
What about you, Suhas? You have 4 poems here. Did you compose them in Sanskrit and then translate them, or were you doing both simultaneously in your head? Because of the after doing 200 odd poems, I suppose simultaneous translation must be happening.
I mean, when I compose in Sanskrit, the mental effort is all in Sanskrit. There is no English or Kannada or anything mediating that. And after that, I translated it into English. So if you take the Sanskrit version of the poems that I have written, and you show it to a Sanskrit scholar, they will read it and they will tell you this sounds exactly like a classical Sanskrit poem with no mediation of any other language. Whereas the English translations that has been presented is like any other translation we have done, where we have had to modify a few things to make it accessible to an English-speaking audience. I definitely identify strongly as a Sanskrit poet. I write a lot of Sanskrit poetry in the old tradition, in the old classical meters, things like that, purely for fun. But I don't think that I really consider the translations in this book as any poetic effort from me. In fact, I feel that there's perhaps a lot of room for improvement in the style of these translations, but it's really the curation that's doing most of the magic, which nobody has succeeded in doing so far, because it's a lot of effort. Reading 10,000 poems is not an easy task.
So I had this thought that both of you immersed lovers of Sanskrit poetry and therefore loving it in all its maximalism, all the ornamentation and all the flourishes. And the translations are crisp, spare sometimes. Is it easy living in both these realms, or was there a bit of a pang that in order to make this more accessible, you have to remove some of the stuff that you clearly must be loving, otherwise you wouldn't be loving this poetry?
That's a fantastic question. I would say there is always this, this is the pain of a translator, always. I think what helped us was that if we were to translate it with all its frills and fancies, we would still have that pang because it's not conveying what we wanted to. So
it was a trade-off that you had to
Yes. So it's the trade-off that every translator has to make, and this was ours. And I think we're much happier reading these versions of the poems than we were with some of the frills and fancies attached, which are truly impossible to translate. So this is not a romantic verse, but I don't even need to tell you about the tone of the verse if I just recite a couple of lines of it. So this verse goes, Ukti pratyukti marga krama parichayavan asti kaschid vipaschid yadyasmin swasti tasmai budhavara samitau bibhyadabhyagato bhut. So you already know it's almost like a declaration of war. It's someone inviting any learned scholar to challenge him.
I'll give you another example which I like a lot. Swachandochala dacha kacha kuhara chateta rambuchata murchan moha maharshi harsha kalitasva. So it goes in this fashion. But what this is it's a description of the torrential flow of the Ganga. Swachandochala dacha kacha kuhara. So the way it lashes against rocks and the spray goes into the sky and things like this. But you can actually hear this in the verse. And we are today, unfortunately, embedded in a sort of literary environment where no matter what you publish, there is some blurb writer or some reviewer who's willing to say that this is the most sonorous translation that's ever been made. They managed to completely capture what the original has in the translation. And we feel that we have not read any Sanskrit translation so far that managed to do any justice. In fact, it's impossible. You can't do this in English.
We feel like if you're making the claim, it is a dishonest claim. Because how can you capture the effect of what we just recited in Sanskrit? In a language like English, the properties of English are not suited for...
You have this little example in your introduction where you compare, maybe you'd like to talk about that, about the idea of transplanting an Indian wedding into an English countryside.
Yeah, so we give this example in our introduction. So a Sanskrit poem is like an Indian wedding. There are about 1,000 people milling all around. Everybody is dressed in finery. And unless you know where to look, you can't even spot who the bride and groom are, because everybody is really, and there's drums playing and there's fireworks and everything. And an English poem is like a church wedding in England, very prim and proper. And the maximum you could really do to alter that is maybe you could serve samosas. But there's not really, you can't bring a horse into a church and have the horse trot down the aisle. That's not happening. But I think that's what translators today claim to do. They claim to be bringing a horse to a church wedding, which they don't do, and which also doesn't work. So we have adopted this minimalist approach which does justice to English and also does justice to the ideas in Sanskrit. And for that reason, we don't pick up verses like Swachando Chaladacha Kacha Kuhara, because they cannot be translated and they are not in this book.
So the chapters, there are 9 chapters in this book, and they're called How to Flirt, How to Keep It a Secret, How to Daydream, How to Yearn, How to Quarrel, How to Make Love, How to Make It Work, How to Break Up, and How to Let Go. And when I came across this poem, which is poem number 165, which says, love with a capital L. If you let their slips pass, if you peer into vogue for advice, if you can bear to be apart, whatever it is not love. And it made me laugh a lot because, one assumes, one knows about the tradition in, say, Cosmopolitan, which will have these little pithy columns on relationship advice and dating advice. And at first glance, your title, chapter headings sound like that, but they're not really, because you're not really dispensing advice here. You have, I would say, they're more of groupings rather than a how-to manual for any of these. What was your thought in the segregations that you made?
Yes, so I think that's 2 questions rolled into one, and I'll try to answer both. So the first is that the categorization of a traditional Sanskrit anthology runs in sections, like I mentioned before. So there's one on prayers, and then it's sorted by various gods. So pray to Ganesha, pray to Vishnu, pray to Shiva, and so on. And then you have the romantic section, which is sorted by everything from the age of the characters involved to there's an entire section on the description of a woman's eyes, the description of a woman's lips, and so on. And so it goes. And we didn't want to do that because it also doesn't make sense. And since we need to do a lot of explication, but we didn't want to insert it into the verse itself, which would make it difficult to read, we thought we would give a hint of it in the title.
Chapter titles.
Yeah. So that was part of our idea to group it in this way. But of course, the titles that we've mentioned are outside of the verse itself. They're not there in the Sanskrit verse because Sanskrit verses are not grouped that way. But they stay true to the spirit of it, and they do give the reader a hint of what is coming their way.
Of stages, really, in a way, of relationship in many ways.
Yes.
It sort of takes you through right from the beginning to How to Let Go, which has got some sad poems also inside.
That's right.
Yeah. When you talk about titles, was this a creative choice? I noticed you have some very tongue-in-cheek titles. One's called Global Warming, one's called Women's Locker Room, and one, I remember, Extrasensory Perception. So the originals don't have titles, right? So this was a kind of a choice you've made to not just present the poem. I remember, I think there are classical poems that I've read, translations in the Kuruntogai, which they just have a number, and they have not used a title. So what was your thinking behind this creative choice?
I mean, so our poems, our translations are somewhat minimalist. We don't use too many words. So in some cases, the title serves to hint to the reader what they should think about in interpreting this poem. And then I think in most other cases where we don't really need a hint, it's just there because we wanted completeness. But I think it's trying to hint.
No, but the other thing is also, I think we're aiming to where the titles are provocative, like the ones that you mentioned. Part of our project here was to take Sanskrit away from its reputation as the language of the sacred, the language that can't be used for mundane matters like flirting, for instance. So having contemporary sounding titles addressing things like global warming really meant to give the reader a shock to kind of
shake them out of this perception.
Yeah, yes. Yeah.
You wanted to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to add something. So it's exactly as Anusha said, we wanted to shock the reader out of their idea that Sanskrit is this archaic sort of language that is meant to be translated into an archaic language. And this was, in fact, something that a reviewer brought up in a very popular magazine. And they called it Instagram poetry, and they felt that we weren't being very serious because we were translating sacred Sanskrit into this kind of language. But I think people who have this objection sort of miss the point, because to the people who wrote these verses, Sanskrit was not some kind of an archaic language. To them, Sanskrit was exactly what English is to us today. So English is not the language that we speak at home, but it does slip in more often than it should maybe. But we're all really comfortable in English. It's an intellectual language for us, and that was what Sanskrit was for all the people who wrote this. So it was not some kind of an archaic language. It was very much the language that they lived and breathed, that they used every day at work, in courts, and things like that. So translating that kind of a language into a very archaic language is like translating some novel that we are writing today, 1,000 years down the line, into Shakespearean language or something like that. It simply doesn't make sense. So these poems are actually written in really fresh Sanskrit that's meant to be translated into a fresh language of this sort. It's not archaic language. So this is known as the King James Bible effect, in fact, because when people consider that the King James version of the Bible is the most authoritative, simply because it's written in a very, very archaic register of English, and that gives it its authority. But since then, academics have shown over and over again that it's full of errors. But to the public, it doesn't matter. Because it's Old English, it must be authoritative, and I think that's also the problem that we face.
So, since you were talking about another religious text, the religious texts we have keep exhorting us, right, with so many metaphors about the risks of the destabilizing effects of desire and love. There are so many metaphors about how to yoke these desires to tread the right path. And this book, on the other hand, is almost like a defiant embrace of love and pleasure and desire, with all the pain and angst that might come in its wake. And I think, Anusha, this is one of your interests, this intersection of Shastra and Kavya. So what could you tell us of what your thoughts are about where this sort of balance lies between the two?
Like I think I said before too, it's important to remember that these were people, breathing human people like us. So you can find a variety of poetry. I think the best instance of this is Bhartrihari. So he writes, the Shringara Shataka is attributed to him, and the Vairagya Shataka is attributed to him too. And the Vairagya Shataka is one of our favorite pieces of poetry. And it's all about dispassion, renouncing the world, giving up. And in that, his voice is that of a really tortured man who's trying to give up, attachment to worldly things. But it is a struggle, as it would be for us today. So we see the struggle reflected in some. We see, for some, this might be a purely literary exercise. So I think there's a variety of people writing these poems, some of whom don't see conflict between their religious duties or enterprises and the act of writing poetry, some of whom are really trying to detach themselves from the world and penning their struggles down. So,
is this the one you were referring to? Neither here nor there?
Yes, exactly.
Yes, I had marked it out for reading. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
210.
Yeah. So the Sanskrit verse goes, Eko ragishu rajate priyatama dehardhahari haro. Nirageshu jino vimukta lalana sangona yasmat paraha. Durvara smara bana pannaga visha vyasanga mugdho janaha. Sheshah kama vidambitohi vishayan bhoktum namoktum kshamaha. So our translation. There's one perfect lover, Shiva, who draws half his darling's body into his very own. There's one perfect monk, Buddha, who gave up everything to do with women. And here we are, the rest of us, mocked by love, dazed by its poison, not able to spit, not able to swallow. So this is Bhartrihari's. So I think this is a sentiment that so many of us often feel when we are, and to see that he wrote it thousands of years ago is pretty inspiring.
Yeah.
So our attempt in this book is to bring these voices back, the tortured ones, the ones that are completely detached and preaching to others to give up love. Some of the others who are being mindful, some others who are embarrassed by love. I think Suhas's favorite verse from the collection is one of about those who are embarrassed by love.
Yeah, maybe we can read that one out. It's 183. This is a Prakrit verse that's drawn from very deep inside a text called Sringara Prakasha, which was compiled by King Bhoja, the famous King Bhoja. And I'm pretty sure that considering how many people in this world know Prakrit and how many would have read Sringara Prakasha, we might be the only people in this world who have read this verse at the minute. So I'll read out the Prakrit first. Salilolla daruaiva antochchiya simisimaya manaim ma'analanena lajja unana dajjanti hyayaim. So the verse is titled Afraid to Burn. Like logs of wood too damp to light up in a blaze, the hearts of those who are too easily embarrassed when inflamed by passion crackle and simmer by within. So if you love but you can't, but you're too embarrassed to actually talk about it or express it, your heart is like a damp log of wood, and it's simmering and it's emitting fumes, but it can't really light up in a blaze because you're just too shy and embarrassed. And the word for this that it says, the sound that a log of wood that's damp makes, it says it's simisima yamanaim, making the sim sound, but can never catch on fire. I really like this one a lot.
When I was reading this book, I was also reminded of this other book I had read a couple of years ago, which is translation of Urdu poems. And in that, the introduction there, the translator, David Matthews, I'm just going to quote from him. He said that when poets writing for Hindi films applied their training, it was often impossible to distinguish between a film lyric and a carefully constructed poem written according to the norms of classical poetry. He went on to say that because of this, in the Indian subcontinent, classical poetry is very much woven into the fabric of everyday life, and you could have waiters or engineers able to recall reams of poetry from memory. And therefore, in India, he says, unlike in England, he felt that poetry is recited on the streets and in cafes. Do you think that's only true of Urdu and not of Sanskritic poetry? Because I remember you have, your impulse to do this was also to bring poetry to the people. So what is your thought on our abilities to...
So the Sanskritic tradition has not remained as the Sanskrit. So you won't find too many people who can quote Sanskrit verses, although there are quite surprisingly several people can do so, or at least remember their mothers, grandmothers, fathers, grandfathers doing so. And yet we have retained Sanskrit poetry in so many forms. So what is said about Urdu and Bollywood applies very much to Sanskrit too. It applies to regional language cinema. It applies to classical dance performances, music performances. Any artist anywhere has more than a passing acquaintance with this tradition. So if you pick out, say...
Maybe a Rafi song and not know that
yes.
all those Chand allusions are very similar to the ones that you have. You have so many poems here referring to the moon, one way or the other.
Absolutely, yeah. So what we now know as cliches were not cliches at some time, and more often than not, they were made up by Sanskrit poets.
Would you like to read your poem, Suhas? The one, or any one of the ones that you have? It would be nice to hear your own poem, both in the original and the translation.
Sure, let me do that. I don't remember the number of my verse, unfortunately.
You have the last three, so I think those will be easy to find.
Those are easy to find. Yeah, maybe I'll read those out. I'll read one of, I can read them.
Yeah, there is 34, which is also yours.
So there's in fact another verse by me here in this book that Radhika also does not know about. Because so at the back of the book we have this thing called list of verses in source language. And we have structured this section to be exactly the way a Sanskrit text would actually be. So it starts with a benediction and it ends with all the paraphernalia that usually accompanies a Sanskrit text. So it starts with a benediction, which has not been translated, that I wrote, that has not been translated. So I thought maybe I'll read that out and
Yes,
I'll explain the idea to you. So the benediction is a prayer to God, of course, but since this is there's a book on love, the verse, the prayer to God, also involves love. Parinaya mala vinimaya samaya sakalaham chatushtayam doshnam duritam apaharatu shaurer ghatita kshirodaya vijayam. So, in South India at least, I don't know about the North, at weddings you have this ceremony where the bride and the groom fight to put the wedding garland on each other, and they want to be the first to put the garland on the other. And so this verse is talking about that scene at the wedding of Vishnu and Lakshmi. And naturally, both of them want to be the first to put the garland on each other. But, Vishnu is Chaturbhuja, so he has 4 arms. And each of those 4 arms want to be the one that puts the garland. So they start fighting with each other to be the one that holds the garland. And as a result, Lakshmi ends up putting the garland on Vishnu first and wins the fight. And it says, may those 4 arms of Vishnu that were quarreling, Sakalaham Chatushtayam Doshnam Vishnoho, may they protect you. So that is the benediction that starts.
So the implication is also that Vishnu loves Lakshmi so much that he let her win.
Shall we throw this open to audience for questions? And maybe at the end of it, you can also read out a couple more poems before we conclude the session. Any questions from the audience?
Hi. So my question, I have 2 questions. The first one is essentially about...
Could you stand up? I think he'll find it easier to see you.
I'd want to understand what's your take on Kavya in Shastra. So what I'm implying is like works like Gopi Geet, where there are metaphors of love which are, very nice. So what's your take on that? And secondly, what's the role of phonetics when it comes to Sanskrit poetry, and how can we modernize it so in order to show the world that Sanskrit literature is actually way advanced? Because I believe that a lot of Sanskrit flirting involved phonetics in the form of chandas and all of that. So those are my 2 questions mainly.
Maybe I can take the first and Suhas can take the second. So there are so many beautiful poems in Shastra, like you pointed out. You pointed out to the Bhagavata as a source, which it is. And then there are so many more because so many of these authors were actually not just poets. They were also writing philosophical texts. Instances from South India would be, say, Appaya Dikshita. From the north, in Banaras, you have thinkers like Madhusudana Saraswati. So all of these are stalwarts who are not only writing philosophical texts in very particular traditions, like Appaya Dikshita is verily the founder of this Shivadvaita Vedanta tradition. So he's writing commentaries on the Brahma Sutras, and still he has so many beautiful verses. So there's one where he writes about, so it's a prayer to Shiva. So many of these are prayers. Perhaps this is a good time to bring up that we're working on the next book in this series, which is tentatively titled Don't Bore the Gods, How to Pray in Sanskrit, where we hope to include some of these verses from a lot of Shastric texts too. But there's one particular prayer that's one of my favorites by Appaya Dikshita, where he says to Shiva, well, you're sitting on Kalidasa, which is known for its snow. And then by your side, you have the daughter of the Himalayas. And then you're wearing snakes all over your body, and we know they're cold-blooded. So you must be feeling really cold. How would you manage to keep warm if it were not for the fact that you're in my heart, which is filled with worries and which are traditionally supposed to be hot in Sanskrit, the tapatraya. So how else would you keep warm if it were not the fact that you were in my heart, which is like burning with its worries? So Shastras are definitely an amazing source of lovely poetry, and that's what we're planning to explore. Of course, since Shastras are more directed, usually philosophical, you wouldn't find romantic poetry much there, except in cases like the Bhagavata. So they will be more of use in our future books.
About your second question about how we can really make the world understand about all of these fascinating aspects of Sanskrit poetry, phonetics, all of that. I mean, it's a difficult question. So some of it is immediately enticing. So for instance, you have this genre called Chitrakavya, where poetry is written with constraints in mind. So for instance, a love poem that I really like that's not in this book is Same sama samo masas same masa sama sama. Yo yata ya taya yati ya ya tya ya taya taya. So the first half of the verse only has sa and ma, and the second half only has ya and ta. And it makes perfect sense. It's a really beautiful verse. I won't translate it now, but writing with constraints of this sort in mind, Sanskrit poets do an amazing job. This kind of thing is immediately enticing even if you don't know Sanskrit. And it induces this kind of chamatkara, as they say, surprise. But I think to go deeper, to really be able to understand the text, you need to know Sanskrit. Otherwise, it's difficult. So there's this nice story about King Hala, who is the compiler of the Satyasai, what we've been talking about today. So this story is at the start of the Katha Saritsagara, huge compendium of stories, which you should read in translation, Tony's translation if you haven't, brilliant work. But what happens here is that Hala is a character in the story, and Hala and his wife are playing water games in their pool, and Hala is splashing his wife, and his wife tells him, Modakais tadaya. And what she means is, Ma udakaihi tadaya, don't splash me with water. Ma udakaihi, udaka, water. But Hala doesn't know any Sanskrit. I mean, he compiled the Prakrit Gata Satyasai, right? So he doesn't know Sanskrit. So he thinks she's saying, Modakais tadaya, please pelt me with modakas. And he has a servant bring him a plate full of modakas and starts pelting his wife with modakas. And she's naturally very upset that she married a man of this nature. And then Hala goes back and this starts off the happenings in the Katha Saritsagara. So basically, to be able to appreciate even Modakais Tadaya, you need to know Sanskrit. So for more advanced things, you definitely need to know Sanskrit. I think, but I think the opportunities to learn Sanskrit these days have drastically improved compared to what it was 10 or 15 years ago. So yeah, come talk to us if you want to know more about it.
Yeah. So I have a question. I have a question. So I'll just give the context. So generally, if you look at the old world, like the old civilizations, like European and Indian and I would say Chinese, I think European civilization, a lot of stuff is like written down and meant to be read and transmitted through text, whereas Indian and more of South Asian is meant to be heard, and hence there's an oral tradition. Whereas if you look at Far Eastern, whereas South Korean or Korean, Chinese, it's more visual. And hence, this is like my theory, and I learned Sanskrit in school, is it's very pleasing to kind of hear a lot of it, and it also rhymes. There's a lot of onomatopoeia, which you don't find as much, for example, in, say, English poetry. I mean, there is some. Do you kind of agree with that? Because it was kind of transmitted, and hence the sound is actually important. How certain verse sounds is actually important because it has to be translated orally, and hence the rhythm and the cadence actually matters more in like Sanskrit as a language in general and poetry in particular.
I think broadly your characterization is right, that Sanskrit and allied languages, Sanskrit, Prakrit, Pali, and Telugu, Kannada, all of them, because we have a very strong tradition of metrical writing. So we've managed to have this tradition where people memorize vast texts and keep them in memory. But also I think it's worth pointing out that this was only true maybe till 500 AD or 600 AD, something like that. Definitely after 1000 AD, our tradition had become largely written. people, of course, were memorizing text, but if you went to any scholar's house, they would have lots of manuscripts that they would refer to. People would only memorize a couple of core texts that were important to their discipline, but for everything else, they were relying on manuscripts that they had written down. So our tradition transitioned at some point from being a purely oral culture to being an oral and a written culture. But of course, by then, I think Europe and all of these other places had transitioned to being completely written. There is no transition in Sanskrit. So Sanskrit is, I mean, the reason why Sanskrit is called a classical language as Latin or Greek is that at some point we decided that this is the form of the language, and we are not going to mess with the grammar anymore, and we are not going to let the way that language changes on regular tongue happen to this language. So if you give me a text that was composed in 1st century AD and a text that was composed in 17th century AD, it is really, really difficult to tell the difference. So the tradition is very, very consistent in keeping the language. And in fact, even the verses that I have composed, 500 years from now, it will be really difficult to say if this was composed 5th century or in the 21st century. Yeah.
Good evening. I'll give you the mic after. Thank you so much. It was actually really brilliant to hear you read, and also it seems to be like extremely well curated. So I wanted to know, there is transliteration at the end, you have the verses written, but why did you not print the original Sanskrit text? It would have been a lovely addition, and people would want to go through the text more and all of that.
This is one of the most frequent suggestions we've encountered after, so we'll definitely keep that in mind for the other books in the series that we're planning. For now, I mean, the reason that we chose to do this is because so many people read Sanskrit in their own script. So not everyone reads Sanskrit in the Devanagari script. If you just look at people reciting stotras, for instance, people who know Telugu would be reading Sanskrit in Telugu, those who know Kannada in Kannada, and those who know Hindi in Devanagari. So we wanted something that would be possible for anyone to read in the Roman script. That's why we used it. But considering the number of people who have told us that they would have really appreciated it in Devanagari, that's something we'll definitely keep in mind for the next books. That's right, yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. So even for us, reading it in Devanagari is 5 times faster than reading it in Roman. But we do have a document that we have been sending out to people that has all of these verses in Devanagari. So if you want it, just email us and we'll send it to you.
Hi. Hi, Suhas. Hi, Anusha. Hi, wonderful host. I don't know your name. Yes, my question is, did you use any of the Ashtapadis of Jayadeva? If not, why not? If yes, what bhava of it has inspired you to use it?
So we don't actually have a verse from the Ashtapadi within this collection. Because Jayadeva is so brilliant and so difficult to translate, because of the sound effects that he creates, which are impossible completely to replicate in English. So a lot of the beauty of Jayadeva's writing is in the musicality of his work that's impossible to bring into English. So we didn't want to do it an injustice by including it. But that is one of our most favorite pieces of writing in Sanskrit. Yeah, so that is for those who know Sanskrit to be able to appreciate, I think.
Yeah, the problem is that a lot of beautiful Sanskrit, if you translate it, it becomes very prosaic. That's the problem with translating Jayadeva. So, for instance, if from Ashtapadi you take a line like Shrita Kamala Kucha Mandala Dhruta Kundala Kalita Lalita Vanamala. In Sanskrit it flows really well, but you translate it, what does it say? It says that Krishna rests on Radha's breasts, he wears earrings, and then he wears a garland.
A beautiful garland.
Yeah. And in Sanskrit it's great, but when you translate it into English, it's just wearing earrings and garlands, and it may make you feel like Jayadeva has nothing to say. And in this context, maybe I should also just quickly talk about, so you may have seen Vikram Seth's recent translation of Hanuman Chalisa. It's a great translation, accurate, and it even managed to bring the meter into English. But it also suffers from the same problem, because we think of the Hanuman Chalisa as an exemplar of great poetry, which it is in the original language. But when you bring it into English, it just becomes a series of descriptions of Hanuman of this nature. He wears garlands, he wears earrings, and things like this. So it's challenging trying to translate some of these texts.
Hi. I'm a journalism student doing my first year of bachelor's, and I wasn't gonna come to the talk at first because, well, I was assigned here, but honestly, if I didn't come, it was my loss. But thank you for all that you have said in the past 1 hour, 1.5 hours. But as a journalism student and a psychology student, I cannot help but ask, since Radhika ma'am started off with the introduction and where you had written asking family members to not continue to a certain chapter, and later on you were discussed about how in between there were a little bit of stop, and you both had different interpretation of the same thing. If I were to ask you people before you had started translating or started reading any of this, that, or if you could tell yourself something when you had started the whole project, what would it be?
That's a really cool question. I guess it would be have patience because good things take time, and I think the book took really long. In some ways, we've been working on this forever because we've been reading our favorite verses and saving them for, I can't even remember since when. But the publishing process takes its time, and yeah, so I would just tell us to hang on and wait. And anecdotally, I studied journalism and psychology in my bachelor's too, so nice to meet you.
We could take another question or so, and then perhaps we'll ask Suhas and Anusha to read out a couple more poems.
First of all, thank you for the great work. I have a question. Closer, yeah. First of all, thank you for the great work. I have a question. You being tech savvy, and we, the recent young generation, are really interested in this stuff, but maybe not have the time to actually read a book, but we really enjoy maybe some audible versions of it. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because my only entry into Kumar Sambhava is Dr. Shatabdani Ganesh's lectures on them. But I'm so thankful that that was available, and I have. So if that form of, these books were available, that would be helpful for many of us. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I guess only that we would really enjoy it, and maybe we should talk to our publisher, and a lot of you should too. Yeah, but that would be something really cool, because we also really enjoy immersing ourselves in the Sanskrit and Prakrit originals, which is why we did this in the first place. So it would be great to give people a feeler for it, or even to have someone who is more musically gifted than the two of us to render the originals along with our translations of it. That would be great.
Yeah, hello. I wanted to ask a couple of questions. One, how different was it translating the Sanskrit and translating the Prakrit? Or if there was a difference, you talked about how there's almost a correspondence, a one-to-one that you can make. Another, given that you mentioned Seth and his translation, was there a reason you chose not to do a metrical translation? I mean, you can do modern metrical translations, so what was the reason you chose not to do that?
So at the surface level, it may seem like Sanskrit and Prakrit are the same language. And indeed, you often see that on their CVs, people who have studied Sanskrit, they also add Prakrit as a language, just to add something more to their CV. But when it's very clear that when you ask them to read any Prakrit, they're unable to. The reason for this is that Prakrit has its own idiosyncrasies that don't map onto Prakrit, so onto Sanskrit. So There are some grammatical forms that are not in Sanskrit. It has its own vocabulary of so-called Deshi words, so which are not in Sanskrit. So, for instance, the Kannada word tuppa, which actually comes from Prakrit, so it's there in the Gaha Satyasai. There's a girl in the Gaha Satyasai who's referred to as tuppanane, which literally means somebody who has tuppa on her face, tuppanane. And there are various kinds of interesting things of this sort. And also Prakrit operates in a different literary environment than Sanskrit. So just knowing how to read Sanskrit will not allow you to make sense of Prakrit verses completely, because the Gaha Satyasai is operating in a universe that's different from that of the Kama Sutra and all the other Sanskrit texts on love. So it needs its own special study to be able to make sense of these texts. And can you remind me about your second question?
The first question is, how did you approach it? Did you approach it differently, Sanskrit and Prakrit, the translating?
Not the process of the translation itself. I think it was similar, but it's definitely informed by a deep learning of Prakrit. Our Prakrit translations are not coming from a shallow understanding. It's coming from a deep understanding. So, but the essential algorithm that we followed has been the same of stripping away the ornamentation and replacing it with an equivalent, the same kind of algorithm. Metrical, yes. So the reason, we mentioned Arthur Ryder as our favorite translation. The reason why we love Arthur Ryder is because his translations are metrical. But we also feel that sometime over the last 50 or 60 years, meter essentially died in English. Nobody really reads metrical poetry in English these days. And if you look at any of the top poetry journals in English, you'll see it's all unmetrical poetry.
I think it's not just that, it goes further, because then which English accent are you really following when you write about them, when you do a metrical translation? Because we've seen some people who say they're writing metrical translations, but it does not map onto Queen's English, and then there's that whole debate about what English we're talking about. And I don't think there's such a thing as Indian English either. It would depend on which region you're from. So then you're just replicating your regional language's dialect into English, and it's accented in a different way. So we wanted something that is accessible for everyone to read and that does not choose sides in this way.
So we're almost at the end of the session, and I thought we could end with requesting Suhas and Anusha to pick one poem each and read out the original and their translation.
So we mentioned Vijika or Vidya once, and we also, I think Suhas spoke briefly about her, and Radhika mentioned the title Women's Locker Room as well. So I think I'll read out that verse since we didn't do that. So the verse itself is Dhanyasi yat kathayasi priya sangamepi narmasmitancha vachanancha mukhancha tasya nivim prati pranihite tu kare priyena sakhyashapami nahi kinchidapi smarami. So I'm of the personal opinion that this verse must have been written by a woman who was familiar with how friends talk to each other, because she's trying to one-up her friend here. The translation reads, "How lucky that you remember every little detail, how he smiled, how he looked, even how he felt. As for me, I felt his hand slide across my waist. After that, try as I might, I can't remember a damned thing."
So I'll read out two very short poems, each only 3 lines long. So it should be very quick. So the first one is called Second Date. And this poem, we don't actually know what text it's printed in. And trust me, we have looked, because we have a huge OCR corpus of Sanskrit PDFs, but we don't know where it's from. We heard it somewhere, when we were hanging out with our scholar friends. So the poem is called Second Date. And it's a conversation between lovers. "When will we meet again, my dear? If the holy books are right, I'm sure we'll run into each other in hell. Avayo sangamo natha punah kutra bhavishyati. Dharma shastram pramanam chet kumbhi pake bhavishyati. So if the Dharma shastras are right, then we shall meet again in Kumbhi Paka. So the Kumbhi, many kinds of hells described in our text. And one of those hells is called Kumbhi Paka, which is sort of like a deep fryer where you're put into a deep fryer and fried alive. So that's Kumbhi Paka. So the next verse I wanted to read out is 50. It's called Extrasensory Perception. And this is from King Bhoja Sringara Prakasha. She does every little thing I like, he gushes. Little does he know, he likes every little thing she does. Yadeva rochate mahyam, tadeva kurute priya. Iti vetti na janati, tat priyam yat karoti sa.
Wonderful. So I wanted to thank Suhas and Anusha. I think the book has given me immense pleasure reading the originals, getting a peek, like a window into what the past, as you said, how people loved in the past. And I'm in awe of the amount of scholarship you have. I think if I asked you the number of verses you know offhand, it must be amazing. And I would, I'm not being a shill for them, but I would really urge you to go out and buy a book and spend many, many hours of really, really fun reading it. Thank you.
I would like to give a note of thanks too, if that's okay. So thank you so much to everyone who's here for listening, to BIC for having us here, to Radhika for writing to us and following up and making this happen, to the director who generously offered his room. We also have a 1-year-old baby now, so we're really grateful to both our parents for managing him and allowing this to happen. It really does take a village, so thank you all so much.
I'd like to thank Radhika Chadha, Anusha Rao, and Suhas Mahesh for bringing today's session to BIC. Thank you to the audience for spending your evening with us.